By the time the Bennett family realized Victoria was alive, they had already spent 3 years building an entire future around the assumption that she was dead. They had divided her assets. They had reorganized her father's company. They had rewritten the story of what happened that night at the lake. And most importantly, they had convinced almost everyone around them that Victoria Bennett had died in a tragic accident. But there was one problem they could never solve. Victoria hadn't died. She had survived the lake, disappeared from the life she knew, and spent years uncovering exactly why her own family had wanted her gone. And when she finally returned, she didn't come back begging for forgiveness. She came back carrying documents that could destroy a billion-dollar family empire. What happened next would turn one of America's wealthiest families against itself. But to understand why Victoria's family tried to erase her, you have to understand what she was supposed to inherit. Victoria Bennett had grown up believing that money could solve almost anything. Her father, Charles Bennett, had built Bennett Meridian Group from a small property company into one of the largest privately controlled real estate and hospitality businesses in the country. The company owned hotels, commercial buildings, luxury apartment developments and hundreds of acres of valuable property. By the time Victoria was in her 20s, her father's name had become synonymous with American wealth. The Bennett family appeared in business magazines. They attended charity galas. They donated millions to hospitals and universities. Their family photographs showed perfect smiles against perfect backgrounds. From the outside, they looked untouchable. Victoria knew better. Her father was demanding, private and intensely protective of his business. He rarely discussed money at home. But he had always treated Victoria differently from everyone else. She was his only biological daughter, and he had spent years teaching her how the company worked. He took her to board meetings. He showed her financial statements. He taught her how to read property valuations. And eventually, he began telling her something that would become extremely important. Never assume the person sitting beside you is protecting you, he once told her. Victoria remembered the words years later because she finally understood what he meant. The person sitting beside her at the time was her older half-brother, Ethan Bennett. Ethan was 37 and had spent most of his adult life preparing to inherit his father's empire. He was polished, ambitious and extremely comfortable in the world of wealth. He knew every banker who mattered. He knew the executives at the family company. He knew how to walk into a room and make people believe he belonged there. But Ethan had one problem: his father didn't trust him completely. Victoria didn't understand why at first. Then she began noticing small things. Financial meetings were suddenly happening without her. Certain company documents were being kept from her. Ethan repeatedly encouraged her to sell her shares in several family properties. He always presented the suggestion as harmless. "You don't need the responsibility," he would tell her. "Take the money and live your life." Victoria thought it was strange. She wasn't interested in selling. She wanted to understand the business. And her father's attitude made her increasingly suspicious. Then there was her stepmother, Eleanor Bennett. Eleanor had married Charles after Victoria's mother died. To the outside world, Eleanor was the elegant matriarch of the Bennett dynasty. She chaired charitable foundations, hosted fundraising dinners and appeared beside Charles at nearly every major public event. But inside the family, Eleanor's relationship with Victoria was complicated. She wasn't openly cruel. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she was subtle. She questioned Victoria's decisions. She suggested that Victoria was too emotional to handle major business responsibilities. She told relatives that Victoria had no interest in the family company. And slowly, she began creating a narrative. Victoria was the daughter Charles loved, but Ethan was the son who understood business. That distinction mattered because Charles was getting older. And everyone knew that eventually, control of Bennett Meridian Group would have to pass to someone. The family expected Ethan to receive it. Victoria wasn't so sure. Several months before Charles's death, something changed. He became increasingly private. He started meeting with lawyers without Eleanor or Ethan present. He began storing documents outside the family office. And one evening, he asked Victoria to meet him privately. He didn't tell her what the conversation was about. He simply said there were things she needed to understand. Victoria arrived at his office expecting another lesson about business. Instead, Charles told her that he had made changes to his estate plan. He didn't explain everything. He only said one sentence that Victoria would never forget. "If something happens to me, don't trust anyone who tells you that you already know what I left behind." Victoria laughed nervously because she assumed he was being dramatic. Charles didn't laugh. He looked directly at her and said, "I'm serious." 3 months later, Charles Bennett died unexpectedly. The family announced that he had suffered a sudden medical emergency. The funeral was enormous. Business leaders attended. Politicians sent condolences. Newspapers described Charles as a visionary entrepreneur and devoted father. Victoria stood beside Eleanor and Ethan while cameras captured the grieving family, but something felt wrong. Ethan seemed less devastated than Victoria expected. Eleanor appeared composed. And when the lawyers began discussing the estate, Ethan repeatedly tried to postpone the meeting. Victoria couldn't understand why. Then she discovered that her father had indeed changed his estate plan. The new documents had not yet been publicly disclosed, but they contained a structure that could completely change the future of Bennett Meridian Group. Charles had created a private trust, and Victoria was its primary beneficiary. Ethan was furious. He argued that the documents couldn't possibly reflect their father's true wishes. Eleanor supported him. They insisted Charles had been confused near the end of his life. But Victoria remembered their private conversation. She remembered his warning. And she started asking questions. That's when she discovered something even more disturbing. Certain company funds had been transferred into private investment entities connected to people close to Ethan. At first, the transfers looked like ordinary business transactions. But the deeper Victoria looked, the stranger they became. Payments had moved through multiple companies. Some of the companies had almost no visible operations. Others were connected to properties that had been purchased at unusually favorable prices. Victoria brought her concerns to Charles's longtime attorney. He told her that they were still investigating. Then he gave her another warning. "Be careful who you show these documents to." Victoria didn't know that her questions had already frightened the people around her. She was getting too close. She was asking why money had moved. She was asking who authorized the transfers. And she was beginning to understand why Charles had been so secretive before his death. Ethan wasn't simply fighting for an inheritance. He might have been fighting to prevent Victoria from discovering what had happened inside the company while everyone believed the family empire was operating normally. And then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday evening at the Bennett family's private lake estate. The property was enormous, secluded and surrounded by forest. The family had used it for years as a place to escape the attention of the public. Victoria had gone there expecting a quiet weekend. Instead, Ethan asked her to meet him near the lake. He told her he had found something important among their father's files. Victoria was suspicious, but she went. She thought they might finally be ready to have an honest conversation. She was wrong. The conversation quickly became an argument. Ethan accused Victoria of trying to destroy the family. Victoria demanded to know why money had been moved through companies she had never heard of. Ethan denied everything. Then he said something that made Victoria realize how serious the situation had become. He told her that nobody would believe her. Victoria tried to walk away. The confrontation intensified. And then she fell into the lake. The water was cold. The shore disappeared behind darkness and rain. Victoria struggled to keep herself above the surface. She expected someone to help her. Ethan was there. Eleanor was nearby. They could hear her. They knew exactly where she was. But instead of reaching for her, they walked away. Victoria would later spend years trying to understand what happened in those minutes. At the time, she only knew one thing. The people she had grown up trusting had decided that her life was worth less than the fortune they wanted to protect. What happened next was almost unbelievable. Victoria survived. She was carried away from the property by the water and eventually reached an isolated section of shoreline. Hours later, a retired emergency room nurse named Margaret Hale discovered her. Margaret had been walking near the lake when she noticed something unusual along the shore. Victoria was barely conscious. Margaret called for help and stayed with her until emergency services arrived. When Victoria woke up in a hospital, she didn't immediately tell the authorities everything. She was terrified. She knew her family would assume she was dead. And for the first time, she realized that being believed might be more difficult than surviving. The police investigation initially treated the incident as an accident. There were no obvious witnesses willing to contradict the family. Ethan claimed Victoria had gone outside alone. Eleanor supported his account. The family described Victoria as emotionally distressed after her father's death. They suggested she may have fallen into the water accidentally. And because Victoria had disappeared, the story became easier to accept. But Victoria was alive. She simply didn't want them to know. Margaret helped her find a temporary place to recover. Victoria changed her appearance, stopped using her usual accounts and began living quietly. For the first time in her life, she had almost no money, no family and no public identity. But she had something else. She had time. Over the next several months, Victoria began rebuilding herself. She worked small jobs. She studied corporate records. She contacted people who had worked with her father. She discovered that her father's private investigation into the company had gone much further than she realized. Charles had suspected that money was being diverted. He had also discovered that several people around Ethan were involved in transactions that could expose the family to enormous financial liability. His decision to place control of the company into a trust wasn't simply about inheritance. It was protection. He had been trying to protect the company from the people closest to him. Victoria finally understood why she had been targeted. It wasn't because her family hated her. That would have been easier to understand. They were afraid of her. She was the one person who could inherit control of the company and investigate everything. If she disappeared, Ethan could eventually take control. If she returned, the entire structure could collapse. So Victoria made a decision of her own. She would not return until she knew exactly what she was walking back into. 3 years passed. During that time, Bennett Meridian Group continued operating. Ethan became increasingly visible as the company's new public face. The family told investors that Victoria had died. They held a private memorial. They closed accounts. They sold certain assets. Ethan eventually announced plans to expand the company internationally. From the outside, the empire appeared stronger than ever. But internally, the financial problems were growing. The transactions Charles had questioned were beginning to attract attention from auditors. Banks were asking questions. Several business partners were becoming nervous. Ethan needed the company to keep growing because growth created the appearance of stability. But behind the scenes, the foundation was weakening. Then Victoria came back. She didn't call Ethan. She didn't warn Eleanor. She didn't contact the family lawyer. Instead, she walked into a Bennett Meridian Group board meeting. The room was filled with executives, lawyers and investors. Ethan was presenting a plan to restructure several major properties. He was halfway through the presentation when the boardroom doors opened. A woman walked inside wearing a dark tailored suit. She carried a leather folder. Ethan looked up. For several seconds, he didn't recognize her. Then his expression changed. Victoria said nothing. She simply walked toward the table and placed a document in front of him. The room went silent. Ethan stared at her. Someone whispered her name. Victoria looked at her brother and said, "You told them I was dead." Ethan immediately denied it. He claimed she was an imposter. Eleanor was called into the room. She arrived and froze when she saw Victoria. For the first time in years, the perfect Bennett family image disappeared completely. Eleanor couldn't speak. Victoria wasn't supposed to exist. But she did. And she had brought evidence. The first document was the trust agreement. The second was a series of corporate records. The third was a set of financial statements. Then came the correspondence between Charles and his attorneys. Victoria placed each document on the table one after another. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to threaten anyone. The evidence was doing the work for her. Ethan tried to argue that the documents had been fabricated. Victoria expected that. She had prepared for it. Her legal team had independently verified the records. Several former company employees had agreed to cooperate. Financial institutions had records of the transactions. And most importantly, Charles's original attorney had preserved correspondence that showed exactly what Charles had been investigating before his death. The family empire began to unravel within weeks. Banks demanded explanations. Auditors expanded their review. Business partners suspended negotiations. Board members who had once supported Ethan began distancing themselves. The company's lawyers faced questions about transactions that had previously been considered routine. And the Bennett family's public image collapsed almost overnight. For years, they had been celebrated as an example of generational American wealth. Now newspapers were asking how much the family had concealed. Reporters began examining corporate records. Former employees started speaking anonymously. The same family that had carefully controlled its image could no longer control the story. Ethan's greatest mistake was believing Victoria had returned for revenge. She hadn't. She had returned for control. There was a difference. Revenge would have meant destroying the company simply because her family had hurt her. Victoria knew that would only punish innocent employees and business partners. Instead, she wanted the company separated from the people who had endangered it. She wanted the truth documented. She wanted the financial records examined. And she wanted the people responsible to answer for their actions. The investigation eventually uncovered millions of dollars in questionable transactions connected to people close to Ethan. Not every transaction was proven fraudulent, and some were legitimate business dealings. But the pattern was enough to trigger a deeper examination of the family's financial structure. Ethan's position became impossible to defend. He resigned from several leadership positions while the investigation continued. Eleanor withdrew from public life. Properties that had once symbolized the family's wealth were quietly sold or placed under new ownership structures. The family foundation announced leadership changes. Their name, once associated with prestige, became associated with scandal. But Victoria had one final document. It was the document her father had hidden from everyone. Charles had created a succession plan that would allow Victoria to take control of Bennett Meridian Group while protecting the company from a forced sale. He had anticipated that someone might try to challenge the trust. He had anticipated family conflict. And he had prepared for it. Victoria became the controlling beneficiary. The woman her family had tried to remove from the inheritance now controlled the very empire they had nearly destroyed trying to keep her away from it. But the victory didn't feel the way she had imagined. There were nights when Victoria still remembered the lake. She remembered the darkness. She remembered calling for help and realizing that nobody was coming. She remembered understanding, in one terrible moment, that family could become something unrecognizable. Money didn't erase that memory. Neither did control. Neither did justice. And that became the hardest lesson of all. Victoria had spent years believing that if she could expose the truth, everything inside her would finally feel right. But when the truth came out, she discovered that justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it simply means that the lie has finally ended. The Bennett family had lost much of its wealth. But they had lost something else. Control. For years, they had controlled the story. They controlled what investors knew. They controlled what the public believed. They controlled what happened inside the company. And most importantly, they believed they controlled Victoria's future. They were wrong. The woman they had tried to erase became the person who decided what happened next. Victoria eventually restructured Bennett Meridian Group. She sold some assets, paid down certain obligations and brought independent professionals into positions previously controlled by family members. She created stronger oversight procedures. She separated personal wealth from corporate governance. And she made one decision that surprised almost everyone. She refused to destroy the company. Instead, she rebuilt it. Because the company had never been the real enemy. The people who had abused its power were. Victoria, meanwhile, learned something her father had tried to teach her years earlier. Never assume the person sitting beside you is protecting you. Sometimes the greatest betrayal doesn't come from an enemy. It comes from someone who knows exactly where you are vulnerable. Someone who knows your habits. Someone who knows your fears. Someone who knows how much you trust them. And that is why Victoria's story is more than a story about a wealthy family. It's a story about what happens when money becomes more important than people. The Bennett family had spent decades building an empire. Hotels, properties, investment companies, luxury homes, private foundations. They had built a world where almost every problem could be solved with money. But there was one problem money couldn't solve. Victoria survived. And once she survived, the truth had somewhere to go. The family had believed the lake would become the end of her story. Instead, it became the beginning. The beginning of her disappearance. The beginning of her investigation. The beginning of the family's collapse. And eventually, the beginning of a completely different life. There is an uncomfortable lesson buried inside stories like this. People often assume that wealth protects families from ordinary human problems. It doesn't. Money can buy lawyers. It can buy security. It can buy property and influence. But it cannot buy trust. And once trust disappears, no amount of wealth can completely replace it. Victoria had once believed her family was the safest place in the world. Then one night at a lake taught her otherwise. She lost years of her life. She lost the people she thought she could trust. She lost the identity she had been born into. But she didn't lose herself. And that was the one thing her family never understood. They believed taking her inheritance would make her powerless. They believed disappearing would make her irrelevant. They believed the empire belonged to them. But they had misunderstood what inheritance really was. Victoria didn't inherit only buildings and money. She inherited the responsibility to decide what happened next. And when she finally returned, she didn't ask her family for a place at the table. She walked into the room and took the seat her father had prepared for her years earlier. The Bennett family's empire didn't collapse because Victoria came back. It collapsed because the people running it had built it on secrets. Victoria simply turned on the light. And once the light came on, there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. The lake was supposed to be the place where Victoria Bennett disappeared. Instead, it became the place where the old version of her life ended. She came back years later with no desire to become the person her family feared. She came back determined to become the person they had never expected. The person who knew the truth. The person who had survived. And the person who finally understood that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's building a life so strong that their betrayal no longer controls you. The family thought they had left Victoria to drown. They were wrong. She survived the water. She survived the betrayal. She survived being erased. And when she finally returned, the thing that drowned wasn't Victoria. It was the empire her family had built around the belief that she would never come back.